I planned for 20 minutes, so this will probably be a bit longer. Anyway, so I'll give you a bit of background on England, because England is often presented as a bit of an outlier or an exceptional case when it comes to vaping. So I'll just give you a bit more data on England. I have no funding from pharmaceutical companies, tobacco companies, or e-cigarette companies. And yeah, just a couple of topics. I'll briefly introduce regulation for tobacco and e-cigarettes in England, then talk about vaping and smoking in adults and youth, and very briefly on e-cigarettes and smoking cessation, although I'm sure that Louise will talk in much more detail about that later on. So, in terms of tobacco control, England, or the UK in this case, is doing very well. So tobacco is very expensive, it's not allowed to smoke anywhere, so as soon as something has 3 walls and a roof, basically, you're not allowed to smoke in there. There used to be a lot of public campaign spending that's gone down a bit. Advertising isn't allowed anywhere, so that includes even at the point of sale. So in shops, cigarettes are behind doors, so you can't actually see them. And in 2016-17, standardized packaging was introduced that you see down there, so those fairly ugly packages with the big warnings. And treatment is available, or at least in theory is available freely to any smoker who wants to have help. France is actually doing very well as well. I've always put the bottom up. Germany and Austria always sharing the bottom of that scale. And despite all these efforts, of course, there are still about 78,000 deaths in England every year from smoking. So that's about 1,500 people every week who die because of smoking. And e-cigarettes, as has been mentioned already, are actually fairly comprehensively regulated in the UK or in England. So it's not allowed to sell them to anyone under the age of 18. It's also illegal for adults to buy them for adolescents or children. And the EU Tobacco Products Directive was translated into UK law, and that includes that before any product can be sold, it needs to be notified to the competent authority, which is the MHRA in that case, and they also test samples before things come on the market. There are minimum standards for safety and quality, so including, for example, as in all of the EU bans on vitamins or colorings in liquids. Tank sizes and bottle sizes have a maximum, and there are warning or information leaflets in packages and labels on the outside. There are also reporting systems for side effects, so if any adverse effects occur or someone becomes ill and there's a suspicion that it may be due to e-cigarettes, there are certain systems in place where these things or these cases can be notified or reported to. Advertising is allowed in very small, or is allowed on buses, for example, or bus stops, but not in print or online, nothing that could go across borders. And there are also fairly stringent regulations on what the ads can and can't show, so they mustn't appeal to non-smokers or ex-smokers. They mustn't show anyone who looks under 25 years old, and can't make any indirect advertising for tobacco products, mustn't make any medicinal claims, so it can't be sold as a smoking cessation device, and mustn't mislead about where they can be used. So a very early ad, for example, was that someone saw the first steps of their grandchild because they could use it indoors, and that I think would not be allowed now. There is, in theory, also an option to have e-cigarettes regulated as a medicinal product, but no product has gone through that and has been marketed yet. Okay. The National Guidance for Healthcare, this is verbatim from the website, so that's nice. And so what they say on e-cigarettes, so they're not licensed medicines, but they are regulated. They say many people have found them helpful. And if you are using e-cigarettes, stop smoking tobacco completely, because any smoking is harmful. And also repeat that e-cigarettes are substantially less harmful to health, and mention that evidence is still developing. So this is kind of the very official guidance on using e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. There's also, England or the UK has a long history of harm reduction in tobacco control. So nicotine replacement therapy, for example, has been licensed for temporary abstinence, or if people want to reduce their smoking, so not only for cessation attempts. And there is also some text that it doesn't really mention e-cigarettes. It just says nicotine-containing products, which includes e-cigarettes that contain nicotine, so that people who are unwilling or not ready to stop smoking should be advised about using nicotine-containing products and should be supported to obtain licensed nicotine-containing products. So there's a slight differentiation between the e-cigarettes and NRT. Okay, and just to give you some prevalence data, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'm using 3 different surveys that are representative for the population of adults. They have different methods, slightly different age groups and locations, but they're all fairly big representative surveys. Good. Leon already showed this chart, which is really a very unexciting chart because it's very flat. So the prevalence of e-cigarette use in adults hasn't really changed since about 2013. It's always around 5%. And because Juul has had so much media coverage, the UCL colleagues now collect information on Juul separately, but so far it's not, no one seems to be using it, or not a lot of people have said they are using it. If we then look at this by smoking status, so on this side, the 3 bars are from the 3 different surveys, and they are the non or never smokers. And as you can see, 0.5% or 0.8% of never smokers say they are vaping, so a very small percentage. It's then higher for people who used to smoke, and even higher, 15 to 20% for current smokers. But that again shows that smoking so far hasn't really attracted any never smokers in England. This is a very similar graph. So the dotted lines are people who used to smoke but stopped at least 1 year ago, and their consumption of e-cigarettes or nicotine replacement therapy. And there we can see a steady increase in the proportion of people using e-cigarettes. And at the bottom, the solid lines are never smokers. And it's just interesting to see that there are some never smokers who also say they use nicotine patches, for example. And this is this is smoking prevalence in England since 2007, when the Smoking Toolkit study started, and it's been declining. So up to August this year, there seems to have been quite a substantial drop compared with the previous year. And Emma Beard, for example, has done some very comprehensive analyses of these data and whether or not e-cigarettes reduced the prevalence. They did to a very small extent, but at least they certainly did not stop the decline in prevalence in smoking. Something that is still a concern, not really to do with e-cigarettes, just something I wanted to highlight quickly, is that smoking is very much confined, or not confined, but it's much more common in people who are disadvantaged, so poorer backgrounds, less educated. We see a much higher prevalence of smoking. People with mental health problems, far higher prevalence of smoking than the population as a whole. So the top line are people in so-called manual occupation, the bottom line there in so-called professional occupation. So a huge difference, and it's not closing over time. And this is to give you a comparison. So I mentioned I used 3 different surveys, and the blue lines there is the information on prevalence of vaping across for the last few years. And the surveys all really agree fairly well. So there's one that for 2019 went up to 7.1, the other is around 5, but so 5-6% is very realistic. And smoking, they all seem to converge on about 15% at the moment. And vaping here includes any frequency, so even if someone says I vape less than, or I vape once a month, they are included in this. Good. And because there is a lot of concern about youth, I just wanted to show you the youth data. Again, using 2 different surveys. One is 11 to 15-year-olds in England in schools. The other one is 11 to 18-year-olds in Great Britain. And so the vaping status here is slightly more detailed. So the first line, therefore, one of the surveys is they don't even know what we're asking when we ask about e-cigarettes. So they just say, I don't know what that is. And a few people don't really want to say, which of course makes sense if you're under 18. And then 3/4 of youth have never tried an e-cigarette. Then there are some that have tried, but once or twice. So we wouldn't really expect that to have any public health relevance. And we have about 5 or 6% who say they are current users, which at first I think looks quite high. So 5 to 6% of teenagers saying they're using e-cigarettes. But then again, if we break it down by, this is building up, by smoking status. So never smokers on this side, regular smokers on the other side, and former smokers, occasional smokers in the middle. And then among never smokers, I've highlighted the red categories there. They're weekly or less, so people are using e-cigarettes at least weekly or even daily. And for never smokers, both of these are 0% in that survey. So again, no evidence that never smokers are particularly attracted to using e-cigarettes among youth. And smoking prevalence, just to give the background again, is also quite low now. So it's 5% in one survey, 4% in the other. So of course it can still go down, but that's really comparatively low compared with a lot of other countries. And this is what it looks like over time in one of the surveys for 16 to 17-year-olds. So really a very neat decline in the last few years. So again, no evidence that the introduction of e-cigarettes has somehow stopped that decline. And similar for 18 to 21-year-olds, because of course a lot of people start smoking when they're 18, 19, 20. But again, we see a decline in that age group as well. And very briefly about smoking cessation, and just to remind people, so on average, if 100 smokers try to stop smoking, 1 year later, only 3 or 4 of them are still abstinent. So it is very hard and to be successful, and most people are not successful when they. So this is without any help. Sorry, this sounded more negative than it should have been. So if people aren't using any help, aren't getting any support, then most of them will relapse very quickly. So that's important to keep in mind. And for one of the Public Health England reports, I'm one of the authors of the Public Health England reports, and for one of them, we looked at all the systematic reviews on whether e-cigarettes are associated with more or with reduced smoking cessation. And I don't think there's another topic where there have been 14 systematic reviews. So this is 14 studies that try to summarize the existing studies within 2 years. That is really very high, and 7 of them included a meta-analysis, so where they tried to combine all the data in the different studies to find an overall answer to the question of whether e-cigarettes increase or reduce smoking cessation. And 2 of them found that the relative risk of being abstinent, so your chance of being abstinent if you use an e-cigarette for smoking cessation, was increased. One of them is the Cochrane review, which is usually the gold standard really for this type of work, so for systematic reviews. Then another 4 were couldn't really find a clear signal, but closer to yes, probably. And then there is 1 that found that it decreased success in smoking cessation. And there are various reasons for these differences that I'm not going to go into too much detail now. It's just that the review by Kilcorran and Glantz is quite often cited, and I think it is important to keep in mind that that one is a bit of an outlier. So if you compare all the different systematic reviews, that one is the one that's kind of on its own by finding a negative effect. And so again, going back to English data, so in England, there are these stop smoking services where smokers can go and get support, so behavioral support and also medication to help them stop smoking. And in 2018-19, over 230,000 people set a quit date, so try to stop smoking with the support of these services. And this is, so at 4 weeks after they try to stop, they're always asked, so have you smoked in the last 2 weeks? And the people who say, no, I haven't had any cigarettes in the last 2 weeks are shown here. So that's the outcome. It's a slightly odd outcome, but that's what's being used. And as you can see, so sorted by success rate, the top 3 groups are the groups that include people who have used e-cigarettes for their support, for their quit attempt. And we need to be a bit cautious with these data because, of course, the people in those groups could be very different from the other groups. They could be less dependent or more motivated or have other differences. And it could also be that the services supporting them are the better services anyway. But I definitely think this indicates that there is some benefit in continuing to look at using e-cigarettes in supported quit attempts. Good. So these are just the kind of summary statements. So England has very good tobacco control. E-cigarettes are also regulated. Prevalence of e-cigarettes is very stable, about 5 to 6%. E missing there. E-cigarette use among never smokers remains very rare. and smoking prevalence in adults and in youth is declining. And attempts to quit smoking with e-cigarettes appear to have very good success rates. We are continuing to monitor the situation through the Public Health England reports every year, so the next one is due out in February 2020, and all these different surveys that I showed you some data of. And so far, it looks like the balance seems to be roughly right. So e-cigarettes help reduce the death and disease caused by smoking by helping people quit without attracting many non-smokers. Thank you.